Welcome in, I'm Artris with OP05 right around the corner. It's that time again where your favorite content creators and me are making tier lists to predict what they think the OP05 meta will be. And so what you see before you is my prediction from 04, which for the most part, I want to say that I think I got most things right, other than maybe Whitebeard being an A tier. Obviously that was an S tier leader. And then of course, once the 4.5 bans hit, all of this went out the window and things just got rearranged. But before that, I think for the most part, this was good. But what I'll do is take this, and instead of wiping the slate clean, I think it'll just be easier to go down this list and then adjust as we go. And then at the end, place the new leaders from OP05, which there's 6 of them in total, and put them in their appropriate ranks. So without further ado, let's just get right into it and get these things knocked out. So in S tier, we're going to just start off with Zoro. I'm going to say that this will still be an event-topping deck. I don't think it's quite S tier, like meta-defining in the sense that maybe like Whitebeard was, or maybe Law is. So I'm going to put this down in the event toppers. I'm not quite sure, though, if it's towards the top. So as we go along, I might adjust some of them to go in and out of like where they rank among each other. Maybe not necessarily to my fullest accuracy, but we'll try that out and we'll get there together. So then we have Law, which I think was a very strong deck, enough so that they hit it twice with the Dawn and Nami with the bans for 4.5. And then of course with those cards being unbanned for OP05, I think it's still a really strong deck. I'm not quite sure if it will be meta defining. I don't know if it'll also be like towards the A tier, right? I think it's actually in between like an A and an S. I think it might be one of those decks that can handle a lot of decks really well. And the only weaknesses it might really come across will be decks like the Sakazuki, for instance, or maybe Whitebeard if we see Whitebeard be prevalent. It does struggle a little bit against Green Purple Doflamingo, but I think overall Green Purple Doflamingo, we'll just jump right into it, isn't necessarily a meta-defining deck. It did get more support in this set in the form of the Don Quixote Pirates, but I don't think that's the build you want to go with for this. I actually think that the film version of this deck is a lot stronger than the support that it gets for OP05. So because of that, it doesn't really get anything new. I'm going to put it in the event topping decks. It might be towards the bottom of it for me for now. So I think Law can stay in S tier. Call me crazy. I think A, Zoro's pretty solid, and then Doflamingo down to A, but maybe potentially B. I don't know how strong it will be overall. Now, Whitebeard, of course, this thing is a menace still. I don't think it will be quite meta-defining with some of the decks that are coming into play, like Sakazuki and Enel. However, it will still be around, and I think it still has potential to top, especially if you're going more of an aggro version, like the Straw Beard version of it. And if everything gets unbanned, if you see all 4 new gates, 9-cost new gates be unbanned, we'll see a completely different build there. However, I think the stronger build for the meta for Whitebeard will be more of a fast aggro version of it, where you're throwing down a bunch of rush units. Like almost everything you have is rush, and you just kind of ask your opponent, can you answer this? Can you counter out? So I think this will still be a very strong deck, but maybe not meta defining. I could be wrong again on this one, but we'll see. Katakuri is one that I actually think is going to be an S tier deck. The reason why I think it will be an S tier deck is because yellow in general is just, it's really strong. I think it got a lot of support in OP04. It definitely got some more support in 05 in the form of like the Sky Island package. And I think there are some cards that Katakuri can take advantage of there, like Gadatsu and even the Rush 7-cost Enel. But it does struggle to decks like Law or decks that go wide. So I don't know if it will be the top of S, but I think it still deserves to be in S. And one of the reasons I also think it deserves to be in S is because, well, I'm going to go ahead and say it. We're not going to even waste time. I think Sakazuki is going to be an S tier deck. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up there just to, like I said, not waste time. And I think Katakuri beats it. I think Katakuri actually has a good matchup against it. And so because of that, I'm going to put Katakuri in S tier. Now, before we go any further, let me just adjust the Sakazuki. We might move this around. I'm not sure if it'll be the top of S tier, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But just for the sake of right now, we'll put it in S tier. Crocodile is one that I think was a great deck. It answered a lot of the meta overall and got great support in the last set with like Red Rock. And of course the 10 drop Kaido. I think it's still a very strong deck, but I'm not sure if it'll be an event topping deck. So I'm going to put it in B tier towards the top of B. We didn't see it do that well in the last set overall, even with all the new support and me thinking it was a very strong deck. I think it ended up topping one major event. But going into this next set, I don't see it doing nearly as well. So I'm going to put it in B tier. Rebecca is one that I really enjoyed playing. Of course, you can check out one of my profile videos if you'd like, where I did placed top 32 in an event with Rebecca. This deck changes a little bit more for this meta, and of course, I think it gets outclassed by Sakazuki. But what this deck does is it outshines everybody with consistency. You can go full Dressrosa with all of the support that is coming in OP05. And so I think it still has a place somewhere in the meta. I don't think it's going to be quite an event topping deck because even though it might outgrind Sakazuki, it does have struggles against a lot of other decks like Katakuri. It'll struggle against Purple Luffy. It'll struggle against, which we're going to see a lot of those two decks in the meta. And because of that, I don't think it'll event top quite as much, but I think it'll still be a deck that you should watch out for. So I'm going to put it in B, below Crocodile for now, because Crocodile just absolutely dunks on Rebecca. But overall, Rebecca's still a competitive deck. Now, Yamato is one that I think was an event-topping deck. We didn't really see it do much last set. I still think that it's a very strong deck. Is it an event-topping deck for OP05? That's a good question. The one thing about this leader is that your leader is kind of just a vanilla leader until the end of the game, and it becomes like a pseudo Whitebeard. But regardless, the yellow package is strong. I don't know if it's quite an event-topping deck for this set, because I think that there's other yellow decks that will outshine it, like Katakuri, for instance. So I'm going to put it in the competitive tier. I'm not quite sure where in the competitive tier just yet. So because of that, I'm going to put it below Rebecca, but we'll adjust it as we go along. And of course, we put Doflamingo in the event topping deck. I kind of still think it'll be a strong deck to compete against some of these other decks, especially with the film package being able to spam out a board, and some of these decks like Sakazuki, which can only really take care of one or two characters at a time. I think Doflamingo might have a good chance there. So on to the other decks that we haven't covered yet. Queen was a good deck. Queen was actually a lot better of a deck than I anticipated, in the sense that it did top some events towards the end of the set, where 4.5 allowed it to really not have to worry about too much outside of maybe Katakuri. And before the 4.5 bans came, it was still a strong deck. I think we saw it top a couple of times as well. It's one of those that's just a real grindy deck. So if you like having no friends and going to time every single time, and I'll say this till the end of time, which I guess I'll be playing Queen if that's the case, this deck is for you. I don't know if it's competitive. I want to say it still is. I don't think it's a leave a locals. I think you can still do well with this deck, but you might still have some struggles against other things like maybe Sakazuki, because with Queen, the one thing that you're really doing is playing like one or two bodies a turn. And like Sakazuki, which I'm going to be pointing to as a reference for a lot of these decks, how they compete, is going to struggle, because if you're only playing one body a turn and Sakazuki can take care of one body a turn, then you're not going to be able to proc your leader effect. But against other decks like maybe Zoro or Whitebeard, you might do okay. Blue Purple Kaido is one that I wanted to be really competitive. The only issue with this deck is that it is at 4 life. It got a lot of support last set, and it got a lot of more support this set as well, in the form of the 4-cost ulti, which basically is the most OP searcher. And then, of course, you got another 10-drop Kaido, which allows you to add 4 cards to your hand if your opponent is at 3 life or less, which that's crazy. But regardless, the 4 life really hurts this leader. I'm going to put it in competitive because I think it still has potential to do really well. But I'm going to put it towards the bottom of competitive right now, and then we'll fill out the gaps as we go along. I don't think it's quite near the bottom of competitive, but because we still have all these other leaders to go through, I'm going to put it here. Isho is one that I thought could have done well, but once again, 4 life really hurts a lot of these leaders, especially in the mid game, which Isho does really well at. But unfortunately, I think this is one that might just be a leave it locals for this next set. Green didn't get a lot of good support. Black got some support overall, but I think the black support that we did get for these decks is better in other decks than this. I will say, though, that all these black decks do get the addition of Lucci, which is a very strong card overall. But Isho doesn't take advantage of that nearly as well as some of the other decks do. So I'm going to put it at the Leave It locals. Next up, we have Red Purple Luffy, which was a competitive deck towards the end of the set. Of course, it came out towards the end of the set, but it was competitive as soon as it came out. We saw it topping in Europe a couple of events. I actually think this will be an event-topping deck, probably along the lines of maybe a Whitebeard, or can it beat Zoro? Yeah, I think it can beat Zoro. Zoro's one, though, that is a little bit of a tough deck to fight against Red Purple Luffy because it just pokes you down, and that's the last thing Red Purple Luffy wants. But this set with OP05, Purple got a lot more support. Of course, the structure deck, which this leader came from, provides a lot of support as well. So I think this is a really strong deck, and we'll see it top a couple of events. Nami is one that I think had its chance to shine in 4.5, and it did really well. I think it was one of those decks that's really annoying. If you know how to fight it, good for you, but sometimes if Nami sees what it sees, then game over, right? So I think it still can be a competitive deck. It's definitely a gatekeeping deck for sure. So I'm actually going to put this a little bit below. I'm going to put it below Kaido. I don't think it's necessarily a great competitive deck. I think you can probably win a fair amount of games. If you're going to like a 9-round tournament, you probably win like 7 rounds comfortably, and then maybe struggle through 2 or 3. So yeah, I think this is still a strong deck, but overall, not necessarily the most competitive. Ace is one that I think didn't get much of anything, right? This is one that keeps catching strays with all the bans that we keep getting, and of course the 5-cost Marco is coming back. But is that enough for this deck to be in the competitive tier? That is a good question. I think Vampire Gaming would probably argue yes, and I would probably argue no. As a Ace fanboy myself, I would say I want this deck to be extremely good, but because there's a lot of other decks that are coming into the meta that probably outshine it, I'm going to put it at the Leave It locals, but I think there is potential for it. Don't get me wrong. I think there is potential for this deck to do well. It's just that Red didn't get a lot of good support this set, and I think there's a lot of decks that can answer Ace overall. So I think it's a really strong deck, almost to the point where it could be competitive, but I'm going to put it in the Leave It locals. I am probably going to hate myself for doing that later on. Green Kid is, I think, a strong deck overall with the film package. Once again, though, Green didn't get a lot of new support. I think it still is a competitive deck, probably above Kaido. I think it does good against all of these 4-life leaders for the most part, but the big issue that this deck comes across is that if you can remove its bodies, which a lot of decks can do, then it doesn't really have too much that it can do. And of course, removing blockers in the form of attacking is the only way that it can do it. So I'm going to put it in competitive, but I think a lot of the green decks are going to suffer this set. So this might be the highest green deck we see outside of like green, purple, Doflamingo. And that's just because purple is just so strong. On the flip side, though, when I say purple is so strong, I'm not entirely sure that yellow, purple, Laker Croc is strong. I'm sorry to say. I feel like it gets outgrinded by a lot of the other decks that heal, for instance, Nell or Katakuri. And then, of course, the purple package does fit somewhere in this deck, but it just feels a little off because what you're trying to do with this leader is kind of stall and then play your Crocodile 8-drop and then your 9-drop Yamato. Are you playing a 7-drop Kid? I don't know. You could. I mean, there's ways to make this deck strong, but I think it needs to be cooked on first. So I'm going to put it in the Leave It locals. I don't think it's going to be a quite competitive deck. And then once again, 4-life really does hurt this leader. Now, Lucci is one that I thought would be competitive last set. We didn't see a lot of people playing it, probably because everyone wants to play like a newer leader. I think this deck still is strong overall, but we did see other black decks like Luffy pop up in the meta, and we didn't see Lucci really do that well. We did see some things come from it, like maybe the Dressrosa package in this leader, but once again, I don't know if this deck is going to perform at all because it didn't really perform last set, and it didn't really get too much new other than, of course, Lucci, but it feels weird that Lucci is better in the Sakazuki deck than the actual Lucci deck itself, but I'm gonna put this leader in the leave it locals, probably cook on it a little bit, and I think it might do okay. Because it wants to run like the CP9 package overall and using air door, there's not a lot of support that was added to this overall. So I'm going to put this at the leave it locals. I think it could do okay, but I don't see it like winning any events. Next up, we have Smoker, which I think Smoker is still a competitive black deck. Now, I know that Lucci is down in the leave it locals, and I think Smoker deserves a little bit better. I think the package, like the Navy package that it has, is very strong, and being able to play everything you need on curve, pop a body every turn, and then also add like a big body like Sakazuki, or even the Lucci fits in this deck really well. So I'm going to keep it in the competitive tier. I'm going to put it probably above Kid. I think it does okay against 4-life leaders, and I think once again Nami is going to be the bottom of competitive because it is once again like a gatekeeping deck. Magellan got a lot of purple support, and I think Magellan is going to continue to be a competitive deck. So we're going to leave it here. Now, does it fall exactly where it is right now? I think it is maybe the middle of the pack leader. I think it could do okay. I'm surprised that it didn't do better last set with everything that it got. But of course, this set, it gets even more. And so because of that, I'm leaving it in the competitive tier. Yellow Big Mom is a deck that I think has been overshadowed by Katakuri and will continue to be overshadowed by Katakuri. I think, though, this deck has potential to do well. But once again, it's going to be overshadowed by Katakuri, and then I think the other yellow leader that we're going to see this set from Enel is also going to overshadow this. It's going to be in the competitive tier, but I don't think it's quite going to top any events anytime soon. But I do want to see this leader do well overall. Next, we have Yellow Black Big Mom, which I think is just a slightly worse version of the Mono Yellow Big Mom. It does have some synergy with the minusing effects and then being able to KO stuff. So it does get the addition of Gadatsu, which if you have like Ice Age in this deck and then you play Gadatsu on whatever you want, like it's really strong, but it does require a lot of cards out of hand. And of course you're at 4 life and you're not drawing as many cards in this deck. The one problem that black decks do struggle with is having enough cards in hand. And so because they're constantly dropping cards to KO things on the field, they have low hand size. And then of course, if you couple that with a low life total off the bat, you do see it struggle. So of course, this leader does heal when you get down to 1 life, but at that point in the game, paying 2 Dawn to heal 1 is, I actually think it's more than that, right? It's like, it's not great. It's really not, but I want it to do well. I want all these decks to do well. I can't keep saying that, but I'm going to continue to say it. I want all these decks to do well because, of course, having a diverse meta is a good thing, but I don't think it's competitive. I'm going to put it at the leave it locals, probably below Lucci if I had. Next up, we have Blue Doflamingo. This deck is still strong. I think that it is going to probably be okay against a lot of the meta. I think it's like a middle of the pack competitive deck. Didn't get any support last set really, other than like Red Rock, and it doesn't get really much any support this set other than the blue deck. It doesn't get much support in this set either. Of course, blue does get a couple of strong cards, but overall, I don't think you're going to add them to this deck. This deck is very much focused on playing Warlords, and because we're not getting a lot of Warlords in recent sets, it kind of just stays stagnant, but it's still a strong deck overall. So I'm going to leave it in competitive, probably just leave it exactly where it's at. Kuro is one that I think is going to struggle really hard against decks like Sakazuki, and especially decks like Enel that just kind of sustain itself. And of course, like Purple Luffy is going to outramp it and kind of just like, once you get your 9-drop on the field, what is it going to do? So this deck is a leave it locals for me. Unfortunately, green, like I mentioned earlier, isn't getting much great support in the form of just generic good cards. So I'm going to put it down at the leave it locals. Probably around here. Same thing with Kinemon. Kinemon's a strong deck towards the end of 4.5. We saw some players like Will to Win Gaming pilot it and do all right with it. Of course, though, this deck is suffering from being green, so I'm putting it at the Leave It Locals. I don't think it's going to be quite a competitive deck. If you're wanting a competitive green deck, just stick with Kid or like Green Purple Doflamingo. I think it's probably a better version of Kuro, maybe, although they're completely different decks. What I mean by that, for green, it's a better green deck than Kuro. And then we're gonna see Red Luffy also kind of be in the same field as Ace, where it has just generically good, strong cards. It definitely has a strong rush beatdown style of play in this next set. However, with that comes the vulnerability of losing cards out of hand when your opponent attacks into your board instead of your face. And so because of that, you can get choked out pretty easily playing this deck. It can do okay. I don't think it's going to be one of those decks that goes like 9-0 or anything at a tournament, so I'm going to put it at the Leave It Locals, but I actually think it's probably better than Ace, or maybe around the same level as Ace. Not to say Leave It Locals is a bad tier to be in. These decks still have some promise, but I don't think they're quite strong enough to take to a big tournament. And then I think that covers it for competitive, so let's just go down to the C Leave It Locals for the last set, what I thought would be there. Looks like we're skimming over here because we've already touched these decks. Red, Purple, Kid. Now, this is a strange one because I don't think anyone thinks about this deck. And, of course, Purple is a strong color overall. I don't know if this deck is going to do well because nobody plays it. So maybe this is a video I can do later this set and kind of touch on this deck and see if there's anything spicy going on. So I'm going to say Leave It Locals for now because there's other better purple decks to play. But I will say it is probably the strongest deck at the Leave It Locals, because if you take this deck and you build it out with all of the new purple support, you play anything that is along like the Kid Pirates package, you have like a new Searcher and purple for it, I think this deck can do okay. But if you're playing this deck, then why not just play either like Red Purple Law or like Red Purple Luffy, right? Because those decks are also really strong. And the ability to give your leader a boost for power by minusing Dawn is pretty strong overall, but is it enough to make it a competitive deck? Time will tell, but I'm going to say no for now. Next, we're looking at Z, which I think Z is actually a pretty strong deck overall. I think it's always been a strong deck, but once again, being 4 life, it really hurts it, and it's one of those decks that needs a lot of setup. And of course, the longer the game goes on, the better it becomes. However, it just struggles by getting to that late game because there are decks that kind of outclass it or just like remove a lot of its bodies or whatever it may be. But I will say, because purple is a strong color overall for this set, it will be a top of the Leave It Locals, probably around the Red Purple Kid era. But I think that this could have potential to do a little bit better with all, like, I don't know, the new Lucci that we see, and then of course purple just being purple. Blue Green Sanji. Now this is a strange one. Nobody ever plays this deck, and I can see why. It's one of those that it just felt a little odd to play. Your hand size is constantly going down because you're playing like a body, or actually like 2 or 3 bodies a turn, and so you don't really have a lot of cards in hand. And of course, being at 4 life, you don't get a lot of card draw like you would with a 5 life leader. You don't get that extra card. But I think that it can take advantage of some of the cards that are in the meta, like maybe the 10 cost Kaido, being able to refill your hand towards the end of the game and having a huge threat. And of course, like, blue just has great removal in general. I think this deck still remains at a Leave It Locals tier. And I might just put it in the middle of the pack. I don't know if it will do better than any of the other decks that are ahead of it. And it might just do better than some of the decks that are behind it. So we'll leave it here, and maybe somebody can prove me wrong in this next set. Of course, Arlong is a really strong leader from the end of 4.5. We saw it compete pretty well with Katakuri, but I think when things get unrestricted, it's going to struggle against aggro decks, because even though it is kind of like an aggro mid-range deck that throws a lot of bodies on board while it's also attacking face or doing 7 to whatever it wants to do, I don't know if that's enough to really make it a deck that will last for a whole tournament. That's what you have to consider when doing these tier lists, is like, is this deck good enough to make it 9 rounds consistently against other decks that it will come across? I just don't think it will. This deck, though, gets a little bit more support, like, once again, with a couple of other cards like Gadatsu. Gadatsu is just a great yellow card. And then you could add the 7 cost Rushanel pretty much in any yellow deck, because the stipulation to run it is just be a yellow leader. So I think it still remains at Leave It Locals. This one might be a little bit higher up in the tier because I do think we saw some play, and the play was pretty good with it too as well. So I'm going to put it above Kinemon, but that doesn't really mean much in the grand scheme of things. Then we have VV, which VV was a deck that I think had a lot of potential, but of course not being able to attack is one of those strange things with this leader. With red not getting much support, but blue getting a couple of things, I think it kind of just like stays around the same. There's not much new to add to this. Although I would like to see something maybe with the 10 cost Kaido, the new one in OP05, where you're drawing a bunch of cards, because this deck just draws cards, right? So then imagine playing a big body that draws you 4. It's pretty insane. So I'm going to leave this here for now. I'm going to cook on this one personally and see if we can do anything with this, but I think it's a Leave It Locals overall, which is kind of sad because I think this leader has so much potential, but it is just, it doesn't feel great playing it. Then we have Luffy, which this deck actually surprised me a little bit. I saw it top in a few events and do well overall, and I think it still has that same oomph that it needs, although I will say that it does feel like the leader ability kind of is weird at times, like KOing something and then getting a Dawn for it. Cool, I guess, but it does add a little bit of pressure, I suppose, and require a little bit more from your opponent. Is it competitive? I'm going to put it in competitive, but I don't think it is hyper competitive. I'm going to put it around the same level as Smoker, because they run a very similar package, and they're both 5 life leaders, and overall it's like, what do you want? Do you want a Dawn to minus something by 1, or do you want to get a Dawn by KOing something? It's your choice. Then we have Blue Purple Croc, which I think this has potential to do really well. Once again, I'm going to repeat this so many times, you're probably tired of me saying it at this point, but 4 life hurts leaders a lot, especially when they're like a slower grind leader. If you're playing a leader that like is a little bit more fast off the bat, like maybe an Arlong or something like that, it will be a little bit higher up in the tier. However, I will say, because purple is just really strong, purple is a great color for OP05. I think it can be a Leave It Locals, but maybe towards behind like Z. I do think this deck has potential to do well, because it just has a lot of removal built into its package, and then have a lot of card draw. So some of these games might be grindy, especially if you're going against decks like Enel, which just play for late, or like Sakazuki, which just tries to take care of a board. Croc doesn't really care about the board as much until later in the game, while also like getting rid of your opponent's stuff. So yeah, I think this deck can do well, but overall, I don't think it will win any events. Ivankov is one that I'm surprised did well recently, but I also think it's not going to do well at all in this next set. I'm actually going to put this at the free tier. I am sorry to say Ivankov was one that I was very excited to play when it came out in OP02. I ended up buying the leader for, I think, over $100 at the time, which was ridiculous looking back on that, because shortly after that I went to like 50 bucks and I felt like an idiot. But overall, I think this leader, it doesn't get too much. That's not true. Actually, it does get a couple of good cards in the form of a blocker or two, with like the Basil Hawkins and then the X-Drake. But I just think that this leader is not going to do well, because it requires you to dump your hand, and then you don't get anything really in return for doing that. And so it's very easy to read, and I think if you just play your cards right against this leader, you should win this matchup more times than not. And I hate putting it in the F tier, but I have to put something in the F tier, in my opinion, because we can't all have these decks be Leave It Locals. And so because of that, Ivankov is going into the F tier. I'm sorry to say that. He heed his last haw, I suppose. And then we have Odin, which is green. It's a green deck. What can I say? I think it's at the Leave It Locals, but I'm going to put it at the bottom of the Leave It Locals. This deck doesn't really seem to be strong as of now. I think in the next set in OP06, we might see some more green support, which might help some of these other decks, but Odin sadly doesn't really see much play, and when it does, it doesn't do very well, and it doesn't get much support overall. So yeah, I'm just going to leave it at the locals, but at the bottom of the Leave It Locals. Garp is one that I actually think gets bumped up a little bit for the Leave It Locals, because with its ability, what it can do is use the new Lucci very effectively. It can get most opponents' characters down to 2 and 1, and then use the Lucci to KO them. So I think this has great synergy overall. We're going to put it I want to say we're going to put it around here. Now, this whole list overall, I don't know exactly if this is stronger than this, but just off of feeling alone, I feel like Garp got bumped up because of the Lucci. Red-green Luffy. Wow, this one is one that I haven't seen in a long time. I think the last time I saw somebody play this was in OP01, and I don't think I saw anybody play it past that. Artwork is killer. Obviously, it is the face of Romance Dawn, but unfortunately, that's as much as it gets. I don't think it is a strong deck at all. The ability for paying 4 to restand a Supernova isn't good at all. So I'm actually going to put this... It hurts me to do this. I'm putting it down at free. I'm putting it down at free. I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to put it down at free. Is it worse than Ivankov? I think so, slightly. Sakazuki is one that we didn't really see much play at all in general, once again. And so because of that, I'm going to leave it at the C, leave it locals, but I do think it has some potential to do okay because black did get a little bit stronger this set. But if you're playing black, there's so many other leaders that you can play. So I'm going to just say leave it at the locals, but maybe if you have a good deck list and you do well with it, let me know because I'm curious. I think Kaido is actually really strong. I'm going to put Kaido at the competitive tier. I'm going to put Kaido slightly above its counterpart in blue-purple Kaido. Once again, purple getting all the support in the world. And then it is a deck that lives and dies by Onigashima. And I think the only decks that it really might struggle against could be like a Katakuri, could be Law, some of the S tier decks, of course. So because it falters against those decks, I'm putting it at the B tier. It's competitive. If it can dodge those decks, then it might do well. And of course, it has to get Onigashima. Otherwise, it's really, really hard to win with that deck. Next up, we have Purple Shanks, which moved out of the F tier for the last set, and I think it deserves to stay here in the C tier. I don't think it goes down to the F tier. We didn't see any film support for this leader, but you know what I'm going to say. You know what I'm going to say. It's purple. It got purple support. It's fine. We're going to leave it here. I don't think it really does any better or any worse, though. Red Purple Law is one that I thought was going to suck, and I think it did kind of suck because some of the support that it needs comes out in OP05. It's one of those decks that off the bat comes like swinging for the fences. It's like one of those that just like gets rid of all your stuff early and then plays out its hand, and then can you handle it? If yes, if you can get past like the first couple of turns of the game, then you're probably okay. And that's like the downfall of this deck, but it did get support overall in this new set. I think it is a competitive deck because of that. I don't think it belongs in the C tier anymore, but how high up does it go in the B tier is a very good question. I'm actually putting it towards the middle of the pack. I'm going to put it in between Magellan and Big Mom. I think it deserves a place right here. Then, of course, we talked about Odin. Sadly, my boy Ivankov and Luffy are here. And I can't believe I'm actually going to do this. We're moving 2 decks out of the F tier simply by color alone. We're going to move King at the Leave It Locals. I Leave It Locals. I actually think this deck does deserve a spot out of the free era. It's gone. It's not here anymore. I can't believe I'm saying it. And I actually think Iceberg deserves to be out of it as well, but I think Iceberg's probably towards the very tail end because this deck is... It's just iffy. It does play a lot of good, strong cards early at the requirement of just minusing Dawn constantly, but I think it does... I think it deserves to be a little bit higher up. I can't believe I'm saying it, but it actually deserves to be out of the F tier just because it is purple. And then I think I'm leaving Uta here because Uta is one of these decks that it's just like, why even play it? Like, if somebody can do something good with it, awesome, but it just does seem like a really strange leader. It's like one of the promo leaders, so because promo cards generally are bad, it suffers from being a promo card. So I'm leaving it at the free tier, although I don't know if it's like any worse or better than these, so we're just going to leave these here. It really hurts me to make this list, though, and have these leaders be here. So on to the new stuff. Of course, Sakazuki is an easy S tier, but the problem with this deck that I'm going to foresee is that a lot of people are not going to be able to pilot this deck. So we're going to see something very similar to Red-Green Law, where There's going to be a lot of people playing this deck, but there's going to be a lot of bad people playing this deck. And the few people that are really good that are going to pilot this deck are going to be absolutely amazing at doing it. And you're going to see this deck top, and you're going to see it top in the hands of like really strong players. It will probably represent a lot of big tournaments. And of course, I think we're going to see it drop over time, because what ends up happening is people flock to what they see being played in the Eastern meta, and they're going to go straight for this leader when this leader comes out, and they're going to quickly find out that, oh, maybe I'm not as good at playing this leader. So if you haven't played blue-black or like a combo-oriented deck before, you're going to struggle at first. So what I'll say is this: if you really are keen in playing Sakazuki, keep at it, practice it a lot. You'll probably get better over time, but it might be rough to start off with. And of course, the really good players that go right into it and play it and can learn the combos or know the combos are going to do really well. This is a deck that is a pilot difference for sure. Sabo is one that I think is a competitive deck. I think there's some spicy builds for it, but I don't think it's quite strong enough to top an event. I think it might be able to take games off of some of the top decks in the meta. It's a very strange ability, but I think the ability overall is very strong. Kind of like a pseudo protection for, not a pseudo, it is a protection for your characters. It makes your opponent attack a little bit differently. I think they might attack into your face more often, so you're going to want to play more blockers in this deck. And of course, there are some spicy picks, which I have a video coming up that I'm going to be working on with some of these spicy picks, so stay tuned for that. But because of this deck not really being overall amazing in my mind, I think I'm going to leave it in competitive, but probably towards the very tail end of it. Is it better than Nami? That's questionable. We're going to put it here. Bello Betty, I think, is a deck that is, you either win or you lose. I know that sounds like, of course, that's how the game is played. You either win or you lose, duh. But I think this deck is very blatantly, you're going to either win really hard or you're going to lose really hard. And because of that, I'm going to put it at the leave it locals. I don't think this deck is very good. I'm sorry, but you can read and forecast how this deck is being played. Of course, there's some really good cards in it. If it doesn't win past a certain turn, or if you just kind of play for the board, I think this deck is going to struggle against a lot of other decks. So hopefully somebody proves me wrong and does well with it. I think, don't get me wrong, it is a strong deck in general because of just how aggressive it is. But there are decks that handle board very easily, like Sakazuki. I think that decks like Enel are going to be able to handle this deck very easily. And so because those decks are going to be able to just absolutely dumpster it, gonna put it at the leave it locals. I just don't know, man. I think this deck, something's missing for it for me, but I could be wrong here. So I'm gonna put it at the leave it locals, but towards the top. It is a strong deck, just not for me at least. Rosinante is one that we didn't see anybody really play this deck, and it's a very strange ability, but it is a very annoying ability, and I think it's going to take a lot of people by surprise going into it, like attacking into a character like Sugar or maybe some of their searchers, and then the leader ability is a blocker, and so it can block those attacks, and so keeps its searchers on the field, it keeps its bodies on the field that it wants at the cost of like maybe just taking a life instead. So this is a very grindy deck, but I think it is a deck that isn't quite strong enough to beat some of the other decks in the meta, like Red Purple Luffy's definitely going to be a struggle for it. I think Whitebeard's going to be a struggle for it. Decks like Katakuri that can just like eat life for free with the Big Mom is going to be an issue for this deck. But I'm going to put this deck at a leave it locals as well. But I think if you grind enough with it and you're really competent and comfortable with this deck, I think it could be a potential competitive deck. And that actually also goes for Bello Betty. I think if you know what you're doing with that deck, you could probably make it a competitive deck, but I think overall it is a leave it locals. So we're going to put these new decks here towards the top of leave it locals. If you're really good with them though, they will be competitive. And of course, Purple Luffy is one of those decks that I think is, it's in between A and S. It's like a meta-defining deck, but then also is an event-topping deck. We see it come out of the gate swinging in the Eastern meta very early on, and of course, people kind of figured out how to play around it, with Sakazuki being a direct answer to it. But there's decks like Katakuri also that can answer it too. So it is a deck that I think when it hits its curve, sees what it needs to see, which, of course, I guess this could apply to any deck, but especially Luffy, though. This deck is really strong. It's hard to beat it. It eats its own life at the cost of just like ramping up, getting cards in hand, and then of course playing big bodies like the 9-cost Rush Kaido. So once that thing is on the field like a turn or two early, it's like GG at that point. So I'm putting it, is it an event topping or is it a meta defining? I'm going to put it at the tail end of meta defining. I think maybe Katakuri is a little bit stronger than this. I think Law at its full power can probably beat it with poking it down. And Sakazuki, I think, handles it. Red Purple Luffy might struggle against this deck. These decks probably deserve like an in-between tier of A and S, but I'm putting these decks here for now. And then I'm going to put Enel at... This one's tough. Personally, this is like my favorite deck to come from this set, just because I think Enel is a really just cool character in general, but the ability to kind of last as long as you really want with this deck and outgrind your opponent. You can actually do a version of this as like a Starve Enel, which you just basically eat your opponent's hand and you just outlast them by playing Katakuris and recycling different cards that hit the field, like your Shirahoshis. Is it meta defining? Is it an event topping? For sure. It's definitely an A tier at the minimum. Is it meta defining? I'm going to put it at the event topping, probably towards the top of it. I think it definitely beats Red Purple Luffy. I think it definitely beats Whitebeard. It struggles against Purple Luffy. I think it can struggle against Katakuri, but it can also beat it. I think Red Green Law has its number. And then Sakazuki, there's ways to beat it, but I think these matches are more favored towards Sakazuki and Katakuri, and definitely favored more towards Purple Luffy here. And of course, Red Green Law just beats it outright. So because of that, I'm putting it at the event topping, but I can definitely see it getting to a point where maybe people switch off of Sakazuki and go more towards Enel, because it is a little bit easier and more fun, in my opinion, of a deck to pilot. So we could see it eventually move up to S if that's the case, but I think A is probably the safe pick for it. So overall, I think these picks are pretty safe for your meta. Maybe some of them are a little bit controversial of the F tier. Do these actually belong in the F tier? At least to me, yes, for now, but hey, prove me wrong on that. Let me know what you guys think of the tier list. What did I get wrong? What did I get right? What do you think is going to be a sleeper pick for this meta? Let me know in the comments below. And if you find anything in this video useful or informative, please make sure to drop a like and a sub. It helps the channel out so much. I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you in the next video.